After experiencing life overseas, returning to America completely changed the way I saw it. It wasn't necessarily worse, just unfamiliar in a way I couldn't explain. The strangest realization was that America hadn't really changed. I had. We explore the mindset shifts, lifestyle changes, and emotional realities many Americans experience after living overseas long term using data from the Earth Awaits, Numbeo, and livingcost.org. Stay tuned to the end to find out how living abroad actually changes you. I thought moving abroad would only change my bank account, but it ended up changing the way I saw my entire life. When I first decided to leave America, my mindset was almost completely financial. I watched endless videos comparing rent prices, grocery costs, transportation expenses, and healthcare bills. Every country I considered was ranked by one thing: how cheap it was. I convinced myself that if I could just cut my monthly expenses in half, everything else in life would somehow fall into place. And honestly, in the beginning, it felt exciting. I became obsessed with the idea of stretching every dollar as far as possible. I'd brag about paying a fraction of what I used to spend back home. Cheap apartments, affordable street food, low-cost transportation. It felt like I'd unlocked some secret life hack that everyone else was missing. I measured success by how little money I needed to survive each month. But after a while, something strange happened. I realized I wasn't actually building a better life. I was just building a cheaper one. I started noticing how much of my mental energy revolved around saving money instead of enjoying where I was. I would choose places based on affordability over connection. I'd avoid experiences because they seemed too expensive, even when I could afford them. Somehow, my life had become a constant spreadsheet. Then slowly, living abroad started changing me in ways I never expected. I began valuing time more than hustle, experiences more than possessions, peace more than status. I met people who prioritized community, freedom, and quality of life over endlessly chasing bigger salaries. And for the first time, I started questioning whether my old definition of success even made sense anymore. Living abroad changed more than my budget. It changed my priorities. One of the biggest shocks about returning to America wasn't the prices, it was the pace. Before moving abroad, I never questioned how fast life in America actually felt because it was all I had ever known. The non-stop schedules, packed calendars, side hustles, work emails at night, and constant pressure to stay productive just seemed normal. Everybody around me was busy all the time, so I assumed that was simply what adulthood looked like. But living abroad slowly rewired me. In many places overseas, life moved differently. People still worked hard, but there was less obsession with turning every minute into some form of achievement. Meals lasted longer. Conversations weren't constantly interrupted by phones. Cafes were filled with people simply sitting, talking, and existing without appearing guilty about it. I remember being surprised by how nobody seemed to glorify exhaustion the way Americans often do. At first, I thought the slower lifestyle would make me less ambitious. Instead, it made me feel human again. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. My days felt less like a race and more like something I could actually experience. For the first time in years, I realized how much anxiety I had normalized back home without even noticing it. Then I returned to America, and suddenly everything felt loud, rushed, and intensely urgent. The traffic moved aggressively. People walked fast, talked fast, ate fast, and somehow still complained there wasn't enough time. Conversations quickly turned into discussions about careers, promotions, productivity, or financial goals. Even resting felt like something people needed to justify. After adapting to a slower lifestyle abroad, America suddenly felt overwhelming. What shocked me most was realizing the pressure wasn't always external. a lot of it had been living inside me the whole time. I had spent years tying my worth to how productive I was, and stepping outside of that culture finally allowed me to see it clearly. Stick around to find out whether having more convenience constitutes a better life. I used to think the easier life became, the happier people naturally were. That was one of the biggest assumptions I carried with me before moving abroad. In America, convenience is everywhere. Groceries delivered in minutes, food available 24/7, same-day shipping, drive-thrus, endless apps designed to eliminate even the smallest inconvenience. I never questioned it because it felt normal. In fact, I thought all of it represented progress. And honestly, part of me loved it. There's something addictive about living in a system where almost every discomfort can be solved instantly. If you're tired, order delivery. Too busy? Pay for convenience. Don't want to wait? There's an app for that too. Life becomes optimized around speed and efficiency. But after spending time abroad, I started noticing something strange. In many places, life simply wasn't built around constant convenience. People walked more. They cooked more often. Smaller local shops closed earlier. Meals felt intentional instead of rushed between errands. At first, I saw those differences as limitations. I remember getting frustrated when stores weren't open late or when things took longer than I was used to. Then slowly, my mindset changed. Without endless delivery culture and constant consumption, life felt calmer. I spent less time scrolling through apps deciding what to buy or eat. I became more patient. I paid attention to my surroundings instead of constantly trying to maximize efficiency. Oddly enough, the small inconveniences created more presence in my daily life. When I eventually returned to America, the convenience overload suddenly felt exhausting instead of freeing. Everywhere I looked, people seemed trapped in a cycle of consuming faster, working harder to afford more convenience, then feeling too burned out to enjoy any of it. Even downtime revolved around purchasing something. That's when I started realizing convenience can quietly create stress instead of freedom. Not because convenience itself is bad, but because when every part of life becomes optimized for speed, you can slowly lose the ability to simply slow down and live. The strangest part about returning to America was realizing how quickly expensive habits started feeling normal again. When I lived abroad, my monthly expenses naturally became simpler. I didn't need a car every day. My apartment was smaller but functional. I spent more time outdoors, walking through neighborhoods, eating at local spots, or just enjoying slower routines that didn't revolve around spending money constantly. Without even trying, my lifestyle became lighter. Then I came back to America, and almost immediately, the financial pressure returned. It started with housing costs. Rent prices felt shocking after years abroad. But what surprised me even more was how people treated those prices as unavoidable. Huge chunks of income disappeared just to maintain basic living space. Then came utilities, insurance, parking fees, internet bills, and endless little expenses attached to simply existing. After that, the subscriptions crept back in. Streaming services, memberships, delivery apps, cloud storage, monthly fees for things I barely even used anymore. None of them seemed expensive individually, but together they quietly drained hundreds of dollars every month. And because everybody around me lived the same way, it all felt normal again almost instantly. Then there was car dependency. Abroad, I had grown used to walking, trains, and public transportation. Back in America, owning a car felt almost mandatory. Gas, maintenance, insurance, parking, repairs, it never seemed to stop. I realized how much of American life is designed around driving everywhere, even short distances. But honestly, one of the biggest hidden expenses was social spending. Meeting friends often involved expensive restaurants, drinks, events, or activities that added up fast. There was this subtle pressure to keep up with a certain lifestyle, even when nobody openly admitted it. And if you weren't careful, your spending started matching the people around you without you even noticing. Living abroad made me realize how expensive my old normal lifestyle actually was. Not because Americans are bad with money, but because so many costs become culturally invisible when you've lived around them your entire life. Sometimes it takes stepping outside the system to finally see how much it's quietly demanding from you every month. Keep watching as we discover how different social energy felt abroad compared to the United States. I didn't expect one of the biggest culture shocks about returning to America to be loneliness. Before moving abroad, I never really questioned the social energy around me. Life felt busy, structured, and productive, and I assumed that was simply adulthood. Most conversations revolved around work, future plans, or responsibilities. People were constantly occupied, constantly scheduling, constantly trying to squeeze social connection into whatever free time remained. But living abroad exposed me to a different rhythm of human interaction. In many places overseas, daily life felt naturally more social. People lingered longer in public spaces. Neighbors talked. Friends met casually without needing weeks of planning. Meals stretched into hours instead of quick breaks between obligations. Even simple interactions at cafes, markets, or parks felt more present and less transactional. At first, I didn't fully notice how much that affected me. But when I eventually came back to America, the contrast hit hard. Everywhere I looked, people seemed isolated despite constantly being surrounded by others. Most routines felt transactional. Grab coffee, rush to work, answer emails, drive home exhausted, repeat. Even socializing often felt scheduled with military precision because everyone was so busy trying to keep up with life. The work-centered culture became impossible to ignore. People introduced themselves through their careers first. Productivity seemed tied to identity. Conversations quickly drifted toward promotions, stress, burnout, or financial pressure. And even when people wanted deeper connection, there rarely seemed to be enough time or energy left for it. What surprised me most was realizing how emotionally draining that environment could become over time. After living abroad, I became more aware of how disconnected and rushed everyday life felt. Not because Americans don't value relationships, but because the structure of daily life often leaves little room for them to grow naturally. Everyone is moving so fast, carrying so much pressure, that genuine connection can slowly become secondary without anybody intentionally choosing that. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it anymore. Make sure to watch all the way through. You won't believe what thinking you could return to your old mindset can do to you. I thought coming back to America would feel like returning home, but instead it felt like stepping into a life I no longer fully recognized. Before moving abroad, I assumed I'd eventually come back and slip right into my old routines again. Same mindset, same goals, same perspective. I imagined that living overseas would simply be a temporary chapter, an experience I could add to my life before continuing exactly where I left off. But that's not what happened. The longer I lived abroad, the more subtle changes started happening inside me. My priorities shifted. My relationship with time changed. I stopped glorifying busyness. I became less impressed by status and more drawn toward peace, freedom, and meaningful experiences. At the time, I didn't realize how deeply those shifts were shaping my identity until I came back. Almost immediately, I experienced reverse culture shock in ways I wasn't prepared for. Familiar places suddenly felt unfamiliar. Conversations I used to enjoy now felt repetitive. Certain routines that once seemed normal started feeling emotionally exhausting. Even the way people measured success felt strangely distant from who I had become. What made it harder was that nothing around me appeared different. My family, friends, and hometown all expected me to be the same person who left. And part of me expected that too. But internally, I felt disconnected from my old mindset in a way I couldn't fully explain. It was a strange feeling, being physically home while emotionally feeling somewhere else entirely. I started realizing that living abroad hadn't just changed my environment, it had changed the lens through which I viewed life itself. Once your perspective expands, it's difficult to shrink it back down to fit your old reality. This was the moment I realized something inside me had changed permanently, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, deep enough that I could never fully return to the version of myself that existed before I left. You'll want to see what happens when you expect geography alone can create happiness. I used to believe happiness was hidden somewhere on a different map. Before moving abroad, I romanticized life overseas, as if changing countries would automatically solve the deeper dissatisfaction I felt back home. I imagined slower mornings, beautiful cities, freedom, adventure, and a version of myself that would instantly feel more fulfilled simply because I lived somewhere different. And after moving abroad, I made the opposite mistake too. At certain moments, I started romanticizing America again, missing familiar comforts, old routines, and the version of life I thought I had left behind. It became this strange cycle where I kept imagining fulfillment existed somewhere else instead of fully understanding what I was actually searching for. Eventually, I realized I had spent years externalizing happiness. I kept attaching meaning to geography instead of looking inward. I thought the right country, lifestyle, or environment would permanently fix stress, uncertainty, or dissatisfaction. But every place comes with trade-offs. Every culture has strengths and flaws, and no destination magically removes the human need for purpose, relationships, and inner stability. That realization hit me slowly over time. Some of the happiest people I met abroad lived very simple lives, and some people surrounded by comfort and opportunity still felt deeply unhappy. The difference often had less to do with location and more to do with mindset, priorities, and how intentionally they lived each day. I realized no country automatically creates a meaningful life. What living abroad actually gave me wasn't permanent happiness. It gave me perspective. It forced me to question assumptions I had inherited without thinking. It showed me that fulfillment often comes less from chasing more and more, from understanding what genuinely matters to you. That's when I finally understood. Living abroad didn't just change my location, it changed what I value. And honestly, I don't think I can see life the same way anymore. Because once you experience different ways of living, different definitions of success, and different rhythms of life, it becomes impossible to blindly return to old assumptions without questioning them first. Wait till you hear what living abroad actually changes within you. The biggest surprise about living abroad was realizing the real transformation had nothing to do with the country itself. At first, I thought moving overseas was simply about changing my environment. Different streets, different food, lower costs, better weather, new experiences. But over time, I realized something much deeper was happening. It wasn't just my surroundings changing. It changes your standards, priorities, habits, and definition of freedom. I started valuing time more than money, simplicity over endless convenience, purpose over constant consumption. And instead of living in survival mode, always rushing, always chasing, I became more intentional about designing the kind of daily life I actually wanted to wake up to. That shift changed everything. The biggest mistake Americans make abroad is thinking relocation is only about geography, when it's really about perspective. Because once you experience different cultures and ways of living, you start questioning assumptions you once accepted automatically. You realize there are multiple ways to define success, stability, happiness, and freedom. And honestly, That perspective became the most valuable part of the entire experience. What I learned from living abroad came down to three things I value differently now. Time matters more than status. Simplicity often creates more peace. And lifestyle design matters more than income alone. Living abroad forced me to question what kind of life I actually wanted, not just where I wanted to live. And that realization followed me long after the plane ride home. America didn't become worse after living abroad. I just started seeing life differently, not necessarily better or worse, just clearer. Clearer about what drains me, what fulfills me, and what kind of life actually feels meaningful to me now. And once that awareness develops, it becomes very difficult to go back to living unconsciously the way you once did. Curious about what life in Mexico is really like? Watch our other videos where we dive into the everyday experience of long-term expats who made it home